Hello and welcome to another episode of the Lowdown. Today I am delighted to be joined by the author of 12 Yards and Edge, Ben Lyttleton, to discuss all things football, talent development and high performance. Ben, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Connor.
Ben, it's been close to a year since we last spoke, and with so much of what you do as an author, as a writer, going traveling, meeting people, having these social interactions, how's that routine been affected over the past year?
Well, it's definitely been different. And I think what we have learned through this difficult period is that everyone is on a different page at different times. So while one individual might be totally fine with their situation in lockdown and the health of their loved ones, someone else might be going through something totally different and totally difficult. So I think we need to be aware of that. And that slows things down really in terms of working together, arranging things, working on long-term projects together. So I think there's a real sense that everyone needs to be on the same page to make things happen. And so that has allowed me to show more patience and awareness and consideration of everyone else's position. And I think it's also allowed us to slightly reframe how we work, because I always worked from home because I was a writer, but now everyone is working from home and we need a slightly different language around it. And this concept of even having a meeting feels very transactional. And so one person always wants something from it and it's not always clear what that might be. And so I feel that to have occasional check-ins where there is no agenda is a very useful way of keeping in touch with people, having virtual coffees or whatever they might be, some kind of conversation where you're not just conversing with the other person, because otherwise you're just looking at the four walls of your screen and your world is getting narrower and narrower, and it already is narrower anyway. So there needs to be a bit more novelty in how we interact with people, I think, a bit more curiosity in the things we can talk about and do. And I think it has been a really challenging time. And I'm curious to see what happens when the situation eases and there are more freedoms given to us all, because I'm not sure everyone will be totally comfortable with getting back to how it was before, because a year is a long time to be in a certain situation. So I think, again, we're going to need to show some patience and consideration for other people, because once again, not everyone is going to be on the same page.
Of course. Now, I'm curious to delve maybe just a little bit more into that, Ben. Do you believe in your dealings on a day-to-day basis with football clubs and organisations that they echo a similar sentiment to what you've just elaborated on?
Who knows? Everything depends on the individual relationships, and all work and all talent development and all identification, everything that I'm trying to work in terms of leadership and creativity and cohesion depends on building relationships, having high levels of trust in people and in organizations. And those things take time, and everyone has a different view of that. So there might be one person in a club who's ready to go and wants to get out there and start visiting clubs again and seeing what's out there. And there might be someone else who lost a loved one and is much more cautious. And I think we have to respect both views, because both people have a right to those views.
Of course. And then if we're going to go back right to the start, Ben, what brought you into this realm, so to speak, of writing about football and using it as a lens, perhaps a wider lens to look at self-improvement and education?
So I started off really with an interest in the psychology of performance as a football writer for a long time, and being English, I was very frustrated that every time England got to a penalty shootout in a major tournament and lost it, the coach would say, "Oh, we're just unlucky, penalties are a lottery." So I spent 2 years investigating whether that was actually true or not. And that culminated in the publication of my book, 12 Yards, The Art and Psychology of the Perfect Penalty. And I realized that it was not true. Penalties are not a lottery, and there is some luck involved, but you can minimize the relevance of that luck, and you can do things that help improve your chances of winning in a penalty shootout. And that got me really interested in the psychology of performance, because as well as technique being important in penalties, the key thing is really psychology, mentality, mindset. And so I went deeper into that while I was exploring the art of penalties. And then that led me to Edge, my second book, which is called Edge: Leadership Secrets from Football's Top Thinkers. And I extended the reach of this psychology of performance and looked into how leaders build resilience, creativity, cohesion, adaptability, and decision-making in their players, really around culture. And that is one way that individuals and teams develop an edge. So those are the two things. The umbrella is psychology of performance and using football as a tool for education and self-improvement, because I think the lessons that come out of 12 yards and Edge are not just football related lessons. So the way football managers communicate to their team, communicate to their players, can be used in any industry at all. And in fact, I took one lesson from one coach I spoke to, Didier Deschamps, who was and still is France coach. Before he won the World Cup, he said to me, one thing I do is I never make promises to my players, because if you do that, you'll only disappoint them and then you'll lose some trust. And as a parent of two children, I thought, well, let's see if that can work in my personal life. And I took it into my personal life. I made fewer promises. It's very difficult not to make any, but I made fewer. And it was actually really helpful. So that's the lessons from a football coach going into my personal life, but obviously more relevant in terms of, developing cohesion and building cultures and resilience, and these kind of things are in professional lives, and all professional lives, not just those of a football coach. And so I felt that by speaking to interesting people in these fields, at Chelsea, at Liverpool, at Athletic Bilbao, you could get an insight into leadership and management and talent performance and development and improvement that can help us all across the board.
And I think the most unique thing which I picked up on from Edge, Ben, was that it's fairly relevant and that I believe it will stand the test of time. That even though it was published in 2016, 2017, albeit it's probably more relevant now as it was back then. And we've seen, of course, with the data revolution, there's a large obsession nowadays with numbers and data. We can only measure what we can manage, and vice versa. Often we see a neglect of these soft skills. How do coaches, and you yourself as a consultant, go into these sporting backgrounds now and emphasize how important exactly these soft skills are?
Well, I think there is an awareness in some places that are progressive that they are important. I think people know that athletes probably can't run any faster or kick the ball any harder. So the next frontier of talent development is what is above our shoulder. So what is in our mind. And the data and analytics revolution has been really interesting in this field, because I think it has helped clubs change how they approach recruitment. And I think there is an important place for it, but I also think there's room for other areas and methods of talent development as well. But I think what we're going to be seeing is ways of also measuring psychology in the future. And I think that's what really interesting clubs and individual practitioners are working on at the moment. How can we actually measure anticipation, and how can we actually measure resilience and cognitive flexibility and all these factors that are actually very important in performance and player development, but can they be measured, and how are we going to do that? And I think that is the next stage of the data revolution, which at the moment is XG and all this other stuff that you spoke to very interestingly with Dan Altman about. But there is a next level to that, which is we're going to start measuring psychology, and that's something that really excites me.
It's quite fascinating to see who's going to pick up the can, so to speak, or the baton and carry it from there. Because one of the most interesting case studies was at the beginning of the book under Cohesion, Athletic Bilbao. And in comparison, in contrast, I'm a huge Chelsea fan. Now, what I see with Athletic Bilbao from a distance is that they have a clear sense of identity, one which perhaps Chelsea do not have. And we've seen how Frank Lampard struggled in his attempts to gel over last summer's signings. Now, another case study which you've done inside the book was on Thomas Tuchel. What has he done which Lampard hadn't, which seemingly has got the best out of this Chelsea playing squad?
Oh, that's such a good question, Connor. I would just preface my answer by saying there is more than one way to win. And so not every team can be like Athletic Club de Bilbao, who only pick players from their local region, only Basque players. And that is a huge part of why they're so successful. Chelsea have also been really successful in the Abramovich era, doing things their way, which is changing the coach all the time. So there are different ways of doing it. And I think one of the most interesting conversations I had for Edge was spending time with Thomas Tuchel. And I've been watching very closely what he's been doing with Chelsea. And it is really interesting. And one of the first things he did when he came to the club was to almost apologize for not being Frank Lampard and to say very openly, I have great respect for what he did as a player. What a superb ambassador and servant for the club he was, and what a club legend. And I'm come here to, continue his work and do the best I can, but please don't compare me to him because I'm not him. And I think that was a very important line in the sand that he drew, because whatever the results were on the pitch, Lampard had this playing career behind him that was grace in the bank, so to speak. So he could have actually lasted a lot longer because he was their all-time leading scorer. So you get someone coming in, first time coaching in England, so not probably that well known to many of the fans. And in his first game, he picks Callum Hudson-Odoi as a wing-back. And suddenly everyone goes, wow, what is he doing there? I never saw that coming. And that, I think, was very important, because that was really a message to everyone, to the players, to the internal staff, and to the fans, that he is prepared to do anything to find ways to make this team win. And they might be surprising, and they might be interesting, and they might not work, because I don't think Hudson-Odoi has played wing back since, but he tried it, and it sent, I think, a very powerful message that every player will get an opportunity, and maybe get an opportunity in a way that they weren't expecting it. And whatever it takes to try and find the best solution to get results is what he will try and do. And since then, I think he's spoken openly about players, openly about his tactical systems. I think we've seen Chelsea's social media team provide some interesting tactical insight on how they beat Atletico Madrid in the Champions League, which would never have happened under previous coaches. I feel like there's a transparency and openness and honesty to what he's trying to do. I feel that he's bringing a bit of fun back into the club and the team and the players. And while not everyone can be happy because they're not all playing, they're getting great results, and they're doing things really interestingly. And one of the interesting subjects that we spoke about, Thomas Tuchel and I, when we met, was how you keep training fun and how you keep player development fun. And he's a big fan of this thing called differential learning, which he was told about by a professor at Mainz University when he was coaching at his first club in Mainz. And the short version of it is basically, if you make training harder than matches, when players come to matches, it becomes easier, right? So he would get his Mainz players and Dortmund players defenders to mark opponents at corners while they were holding tennis balls in their hand. So they weren't able to grab shirts or really hold their opponents. And so when you get to a game and you haven't got a tennis ball in your hand, it's a lot easier. And he'd divide the pitch in certain ways, make it a diamond rather than a square. So they could only run in certain ways. So when you've got the whole pitch, it becomes different. And the whole idea of that was to make the training harder than the match itself. So when the match comes, it feels easier. And that's like training for an exam. If you are revising for an exam and you are setting yourself the hardest questions or being given the hardest questions you could possibly get in your revision, and then it comes to the exam, you're going to think, oh, you know what, it's not so bad because I can do these ones. And I think we're seeing quite a lot of that in how Chelsea are playing at the moment. He's giving loads of different players opportunities, and I think it's probably quite a fun time to be a Chelsea fan. I mean, one of the things that really stuck with me was how he measured success. And when we spoke, he was at Dortmund, and they were usually finishing second in the Bundesliga, and maybe win it. And he won the German Cup, so maybe having a good cup run. And he was getting a bit of grief from the local press because it wasn't seen as good enough, because he was coming second to Bayern, whose budget I think every year was over 100 million euros more. And he said, so what is success? How can I be successful at Dortmund if the only measure of success is winning the league? Because I can't really win the league because Bayern have got 100 million euros more. So coming second is the best you can probably do, and then winning the odd trophy. And so there are other ways to measure success, and we kind of sat around and thought about what ways they might be, and they're often intangible. So it would be the feeling that fans would get going into the stadium when they could go, because this is when we spoke, or the pride they get from playing a certain way and seeing your team win a certain way, not just closing out 1-0 wins all the time, which is actually ironically what he's been doing since he came to Chelsea. But in those days he was a romantic, and he was an aesthetic fan of football and wanted to find the best result, always find the best result, but also in a fun way. And so he would often play around with players' positions and play 2 defenders and 6 midfielders, or whatever he would do. He didn't really believe in formations, more about spaces, and try and find spaces in opposition areas to exploit. But that's another thing. We spoke at the beginning about novelty and the same old, and how we can work in new and different ways. And he's always looking for new ways to keep things interesting, but also as a lesson that transcends football and can move into our own professional lives, is how we measure success is really interesting. And I think in football, too often we measure success just by results. We're very result and outcome focused rather than performance focused. Are we seeing an improvement in performance? Is that better than the result? Because there is a lot of random elements of luck that goes into the actual result. Seeing improvements in performance steadily and gradually is much more important. And I think as a youth team coach, and if there are any youth coaches out listening as well, this is something that's a constant debate that I have with clubs in every country, is what is more important at youth football? Is it results or is it performance and talent development? And it has to be the development of the players. And if they're losing 5-4 but getting better, that is preferable to them winning 1-0 and not getting better. So there has to be this idea that they're always improving. And when it comes to writing a book, I have the same questions. What is a measure of success for writing a book? Is it writing a book that some people like? Is it writing a book that no one likes but is really successful? It can vary on whatever idea you have in your mind when you start the process. But I think to think about what your measures of success are, because again, not every club can win the league. Only one club can win the league, and maybe 3 or 4 start with that dream. So a lot of our ideas of disappointment, expectation, and that taps into our motivation as well, relies on setting realistic and clear goals, which are points of success along the way.
I think it's interesting how all of those ideas kind of merge, so to speak, when you speak about high performance, having some cornerstone foundations, such as with Tuchel, Ben, you touch upon having process at all times above the outcome, having non-negotiables such as Tuchel in terms of transparency. For me as a fan, one of the most important things he did at the start when he went into the football club was reintegrating the captain, Cesar Azpilicueta, straight into the first team picture. And when he was asked about it, he was nearly just nonplussed, looking at the reporter as if it was a stupid question. He was saying, of course, Cesar's the captain. He has to play in most games. He has to play this game. And then one other figure who you interviewed, Ben, was Didier Deschamps, who's also fairly transparent. And he's an interesting case study for me. He spent nearly a decade now in charge of the French men's national team. He's a national team manager. He's not a club manager. He sees his squad, albeit a handful of times a year. However, he's quite adamant in terms of the characters and values he wants in a setup. Now, we've seen in the past high-profile players such as Aymeric Laporte and Karim Benzema miss out on making his French squads. How does the Deschamps approach differ to that of Tuchel, or are there similarities there?
There are definite similarities. There are similarities. I think in both respects, they're interested in developing the individual as well as the athlete. So the person as well as the player. And Deschamps is constantly looking for new ways of engaging his players. He watched a documentary about a South African polar explorer called Mike Horn, and he was going to make the players watch it with the players at some point because it took them out of their football bubble, and he found it really interesting. And they're just little examples of ways that you can engage players. But the two things that they have in common is, one, this idea of communication being key to everything. And I told the story about Deschamps and the promises earlier, and I feel that Tuchel would agree with that as well. This sense that if you are going to communicate, don't muck around with what you say, and I think he's been straight with Benzema from the start, which is ironic because they've been so successful without the greatest number 9 that they can call upon over the last 8 years. You know, he's not stopped scoring for Real Madrid in that period, but there was just no room for him, and that is putting the team forward because he feels that anything that disrupts the cohesion of the team is not worth it. So you can have the most talented individual possible, but if it disrupts the cohesion of the team, it's not worth it. And that's really one of the reasons why I wrote Edge, is because we focus so much, but especially in 12 yards, I was focusing on the individual psychology and the individual performance. And Edge really looks at the collective and the group and this idea of cohesion and the importance of often retaining talent rather than bringing in new talent. So you can develop your own talent, and that's often a much easier way of building a successful team than buying in new. And I'm always nervous of fans who say at the end of the summer transfer window, we won the transfer window because we signed the most new players. Because if you have 6 new players in your squad, that's 6 new relationships to build with a whole load of other new people, and it becomes very complicated. And these relationships take a while. And while Spurs didn't sign anyone for 3 transfer windows in a row, they retained their talent. And during that period of the late run of the Pochettino era, these players had known each other for so long and knew exactly what they were going to do. So there was a kind of existing relationship that really helped them, despite having no new blood. The other thing that struck me about Deschamps is a word that probably comes up in all your conversations and is a buzzword in leadership at the moment, and that's authenticity. So he is straight down the line, and he is totally himself. And one of the things that struck me when I met him was how bad his teeth were. And they're exactly the same as they were when he was Chelsea captain and when he was a player, and when he played for Marseille, when he played for Nantes, and he's become one of the most successful individual figures in global football, having won the World Cup as a player and as a coach. And only 3 people in the world have ever done that. And he just can't be bothered to fix his teeth. He doesn't care. He's just not interested. And that, for me, is a very external and quite shallow view from my side. But, you know, it's an external example of someone who is authentic and doesn't really care what people think about him and is just being true to himself. And it seems a very small little thing, but I noticed it and it struck me. And he spoke very openly about the authenticity that he has from his career and when he was a player. And this is a guy who was a born leader. So he was captaining Nantes at 19 when there were 34-year-olds in the side. And when he was 12, he was captaining the under-16s. And we had a very interesting conversation about whether leaders are born or made. And I think in his case, he was definitely born a leader. I mean, I think they can be developed and nurtured with the right mentor and with the right group around them. But Deschamps, you know, is a natural born leader. And so to be around him as a player, I think would be incredibly inspiring. And I know France has developed some fantastic talent over the years, but it's no surprise to me that they are now matching that talent with winning titles and winning tournaments, because they have someone in charge who totally understands how to make it all work.
Of course. And then in terms of mentioning talent, Ben, you interview Ralph Ragnick, Alex Inglethorpe, and Jorge Valdano in the book, and they all have different interpretations of the same word. However, I'm more curious to delve into Ragnick's definition, which is inherent talent plus learned skills multiplied by mentality. What does that look like?
That's such a good question. I mean, Ragnick is so interesting in this whole conversation, because, you know, when you look at the players that have come through the Red Bull system and the coaches, it's just astonishing, really. And he's built it up. And it really surprises me that he is not in employment at the moment, because I would look at that Red Bull model, and if I was a club owner wanting to build a legacy beyond the short term, I would bring him in, because I think that is a very replicable model that most people, I mean, Red Bull itself wants a team that represents its brand. So from that point of view, they only pick young players. They've got a very specific way that all the Red Bull teams want to play, but you can change, you can tweak that in some way. But who doesn't want a team of young players that are hungry, that play attacking vertical football, that score loads of goals, that, you know, 5 years ago were knocking on the door, but now established in European competitions and, you know, at the top of the Bundesliga every season, and have a pathway of players and coaches. It's clear that there's, you know, Nagelsmann is at Leipzig at the moment. At some point he'll leave, and they know who the next guy is going to be. And Jesse March is at Salzburg at the moment, and at some point he's leaving, and they'll know who the next guy is going to be. So there's this constant, very clear pathway and identity to the whole team, to the whole group of teams. And this idea of Ragnick forming it as a mathematical equation is something that I really liked. And if you actually run some numbers on it and look at his equation and say, right, I'm going to take a couple of players here and see what happens with the numbers. Okay, so let's take a couple of players here. Okay, so you pick one player and I'll pick one player. Okay, so I'll pick Mario Balotelli, and let's say his inherited talent is out of 10. What do you reckon? 8? Pretty good. Okay, so let's say he's 8 plus learned skills. So, you know, he's been through a lot of coaches with mixed success. let's say learn skills 5 or 6?
I'd nearly put higher, 7 or 8 perhaps.
Okay,
Haven't
all right,
ventured
let's say
further than
8. Well, okay, let's say 7, let's say 8. So that's 16, 8 plus 8, 16 times mentality. All right, so now that is the big one. So we're on 8 plus 8, so we're on 16 times mentality. So out of 10, where would you put his mentality?
4 or 5.
Okay, let's say 4. So 16 times 4 is 64. Okay, so that is his talent. Okay, 64. Right, now let's do Haaland or Yusuf Poulsen. You choose.
I think for the merits of this conversation, Yusuf Poulsen.
Okay, okay. So Yusuf Poulsen, inherited talent, 5 or 6? 6?
6.
Okay, let's say 6. Learn skills, 6?
6 again, yes, 6 or 7.
Okay. Okay, let's say 6. So he's on 12 so far. Remember, Balotelli was on 16. Right, times mentality. Mentality?
8 or 9.
8 or 9. All right, let's say 8 because we're going on the low side. So 12 times 8 is what? 94. Is that right?
Should know this.
96.
96.
96. All right, so you've got Poulsen on 96 and you've got Balotelli on 64. But in terms of the ability they have, Balotelli, well, the inherited talent and the learned skills, Balotelli rates higher. But once you multiply it by the mentality, Poulsen is way, is the player you'd rather have in your squad. And that is how Rangnick measures talent. Not everyone does. That's Rangnick's way of doing it. Sorry, 1 second, Connor. I'll just get rid of that call, sorry. That's Rangnick's way of measuring talent. And I find it a really interesting one because it does put mentality right at the top of the scale. And when I look at other players, I sometimes run that equation in my head and it's sometimes pretty unclear what a player's mentality is. I think Balotelli is obviously an extreme example of someone who's had great talent but hasn't always fulfilled it. But Rangnick is finding ways of measuring this talent. And once again, that goes back to what we discussed at the beginning, because I think measuring psychology and measuring the mentality of players is the next frontier of player development.
I think we've all heard of rhetorical questions before, but in Rangnick, when he gave that to you, it was more of a rhetorical formula in terms of the answer you're looking for is in the mentality being the multiplier. And do you believe in having this one-size-fits-all objective definition of talent running through an organization? Does that provide many tangible and intangible benefits across the whole enterprise?
So every time I spoke to someone different in the book, I asked them how they define talent, and they all came up with different answers. So while it may be useful to have a common thread running through your organization, everyone is going to have a different opinion of what that is. And I actually liked Alex Inglethorpe's definition of talent. And he is the head of the academy at Liverpool, who in recent years have brought through a whole load of talented players, including Curtis Jones, Nate Phillips, Trent Alexander-Arnold. And previously he was at Spurs, where he worked on the development of Harry Kane, Andros Townsend, Harry Winks, Adam Smith, a whole load of players who came through the Spurs academy. And he also came up with an equation, which is quite an easy way of remembering these things, but his was different to Rangnick's. And his was potential plus time plus opportunity minus interference. And so that doesn't quite put mentality at the forefront of it in the way that Rangnick did, but it put a lot of responsibility on the people around the talent. And this idea of opportunity minus interference. So give the players an opportunity, give youngsters an opportunity, but also step back and let them make mistakes and don't micromanage, don't helicopter parent, or whatever the phrase is. So that I found a really interesting definition of talent. And it's almost more of a definition of talent development, because it's a way of bringing talent through which involves you allowing them to make mistakes. And obviously mistakes is the best way to learn. But again, it goes back to result-based or process-based outcomes. And Inglethorpe's methodology is very process-based, and the results don't really matter. And what was interesting for him is he had the opportunity to be a first-team coach. He was actually coach of Exeter City when they drew 0-0 with Manchester United in the FA Cup. So he was a first-team coach, and he decided that what was better for him was to be an elite developer of talent. And that, again, that is a measure of success, because you've almost got to forego your ego. I think when you're a head coach of an organisation, there's quite a lot of ego involved in that. But if you rather take the decision to be a developer of talent, your ego takes a back seat. And so I'm full of admiration for Alex Inglethorpe for having the presence of mind to realise that, for having the self-awareness to really look and see what his measure of success is in terms of his personal career and ambitions. But also this idea of giving opportunity and not interfering. And I think he has a golden number of 100 matches, I think, that he wants all players to have played in by the time they're 20. First team matches. So it's better to play at a lower level in the first team than wait and not have as many matches. And that's just his method. And that runs through the whole of the Liverpool Academy. And it doesn't work for every organisation, and nor should it. But it is at least a thread that goes through there. And I go to a lot of clubs and work with clubs where they don't have even any concept of it. They just chuck it in the mix and see who comes up. And so I help them find a kind of development pathway, strategy, a purpose, a USP, an edge, however you want to call it, to work out how they want to develop their talent. And often they have the idea, but it's just not communicated very well, so they just can't articulate it very well. So sometimes it's there and you can see it in action, but it's just not communicated. But I think if you have it and it's communicated, it can be extremely beneficial in so many different ways, because it can attract talent to you, it can help you retain the talent, but also it's a rallying call for the people, everyone else in the organisation, and for the fans. If you support Athletic Club de Bilbao, you know what the club stands for. If you support Red Bull, you know what you're getting. Right? There are a lot of teams out there. You support a team, and you support a team because of their geography or because of your family background or whatever it is, but you don't really know what the team stands for or what the culture of the team is or what their purpose is. And I think it's really important now, kind of more than ever, when there's more challenges to people's attention, that teams need to be culturally relevant and stay culturally relevant. And so I help them with that as well.
Fantastic. And I suppose touching on one niche or USP, so to speak, that you do have is the research you've done on penalties, Ben, and the 12-yard Substack, which I'd recommend absolutely everybody to subscribe towards. Is there a single best way to take a penalty kick?
Well, to score is the best way. I would say if I was taking a penalty tomorrow to win a big trophy, well, for a start, I would practice every day with purpose. I would ask my coach to tell me what number I was taking in a shootout, so I knew way before the game. And if that number was to change, if a player was to go off, I'd want to know about it. So I would take out all the variables as early as possible. So if I have a cup final in April, if I have a cup final in a couple of months away, I would want to know what the permutations were for plan A. If everyone was fit, what number would I be kicking? But if star player A was injured or sent off or missing, what number would I be kicking? How would that change? And then I'd want to know in my own mind where I would be kicking that penalty. And I would practice doing that. And I'd practice that now. And if you hit the penalty exactly in the way you want to do it, you should score every time. But the reasons why players don't is because often in the period between the walk to the spot or from spotting the ball to striking the ball, something changes in their psychology that makes them nervous. And often that's because of lack of preparation and lack of purposeful practice, all of which can be worked on way before. And we often hear from players who miss penalties and explain it away afterwards by saying, I changed my mind at the last minute. Well, why did you do that? Because you weren't confident in your original decision, because you hadn't practiced enough or you hadn't worked it out. And it feels quite a unfashionable and boring thing to say, because you sound like a parent saying, do your homework, practice, practice, practice. But actually that's how you get results. And sometimes you can practice loads and you're not even, the exam question doesn't come up. So you don't have a penalty shootout. There hasn't been a penalty shootout in the Champions League for 5 years, since 2016. So apart from qualifiers. So, sometimes you prepare for it and it doesn't come up. But the difference, when it does come up, the difference between getting it right and getting it wrong is obviously marginal. So it's very important to get those margins right.
And in terms of bringing it to the present, and you look at three in particular penalty takers, and Robert Lewandowski, Bruno Fernandes, Jorginho, they all have a similar enough process in that their penalties are largely goalkeeper dependent. And they've all enjoyed tremendous conversion rate success. But when you compare that to arguably the greatest player of our generation, Lionel Messi, and you wrote in a piece a few months ago saying that his conversion rate was just average, why wouldn't he follow suit?
That's a very good question. The Messi penalty conundrum is a really fascinating one, and there are lots of different reasons that might be for why his penalty scoring rate is at 78%, which is exactly the same as what the penalty scoring rate is across Europe's big five leagues, and it's almost the definition of average. He's just bang on the line. And while some people think, well, that's still a good rate, and it is, it's 4 out of 5 pretty much, for a player who constantly leaves us with our jaws on the floor for what he does when the ball is in open play, I feel it's a surprisingly low figure. And I asked a lot of people who've watched him closely and have wondered the same question, and they came up with all sorts of different answers. And the fact that they all came up with different answers also I found really interesting and inspiring, because it just shows it's not a simple solution. So one of the experts said that he thinks penalties are too easy for Messi, and a free kick is a much tougher challenge, and Messi's record from free kicks is astonishing. So that might be one reason. Another one said that goalkeepers must try harder against Messi because it's more of a feather in their cap. Graham Hunter has written a book about Barcelona and is based there and has actually interviewed Messi about penalties, came up with a very interesting theory that when you're so good and you're able to turn games so quickly with a moment of genius, maybe taking a penalty isn't such a big deal. And if you don't score it, you know that you'll be able to come up with something else at another point anyway. So the weight of pressure on the penalty going in is a bit lower. And there might be something in that as well. I did like that idea. And that actually ties into the fact that every time Messi has missed a penalty for Barcelona, they've only lost the game once after that. And that was in a first leg of a cup tie against Espanyol, and they won the second leg of the cup tie 2-0. So they went through in the end. So no Messi penalty has actually caused them to lose a game, which I find astonishing, although he has missed 2 big ones in Champions League knockout games against Chelsea and just now against PSG. So the fact there's no answer also makes it really interesting. And I think one of the reasons why we can enjoy penalties even more is that we can see that, well, they even make someone like Messi feel human. So that's also great.
Of course. And then I think it's no surprise you had a similar and equally interesting take on why Man City, and in particular Pep Guardiola's teams, may also be falling short from the spot.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think that in a way might be connected to the Messi saga as well, because the common thread between the two of them is the influence and presence of Johan Cruyff in their lives. And Cruyff set up La Masia, was a key figure at Barcelona. He's also probably the biggest influence on Guardiola's coaching career. And he famously hated penalties. He didn't see them as part of football. He was rubbish at penalties. And I think one of the reasons why he was rubbish at them was because he was all about intuition and space and fluidity, and that was counter to that. But also, apparently, he didn't have a very hard shot on him anyway, so it just did not suit. Penalties just did not suit him. So he was always pretty anti-penalties, never practiced them. His teams never practiced them. I think that must have filtered through to Guardiola. And his record from the spot for Guardiola teams is surprisingly poor. Not just Man City over the last 2 years, but in Champions League knockout matches, Guardiola teams have missed 3 key penalties that have resulted in them being knocked out, including Messi against Chelsea in 2012, but also Thomas Muller against Atletico Madrid when he was at Bayern, and Sergio Aguero against Spurs in the first leg of that dramatic 2019 quarter-final. Missed a penalty, and Spurs won that leg 1-0. So if Aguero scored that away goal, I think they'd have gone through. So it's interesting, and especially as Manchester City approach the knockout rounds of the Champions League this time round as one of the competition favourites, but facing a pretty spicy draw to get to the final. I will be watching that really closely with interest.
And then furthermore, Ben, you are also the author of a number of kids' books using football as a tool indeed for education and self-improvement. Could you tell us a bit more about your work here in this realm and perhaps the most recent initiative you guys did for World Book Day?
Yeah, sure, Connor. My book series is called Football School. There are 10 books in the series, and the books explain the whole world through football, but they're really written as a way to get kids to enjoy reading. They're written for children aged between 6 and 12. They open up the school curriculum, so every chapter is a lesson that they might have in their school, but you're learning about football while talking about the lessons. And we set it in a school because that's a very familiar environment for the kids. There are loads of football jokes and cartoons. And we find it has a really positive impact on kids' engagement in learning. It's learning in a different way. It's showing that everything is connected. So usually the kids' curriculum, their lessons are English is one thing, maths is something else, science is something else, PHSE is something else, and they're all very siloed. But the world is connected, and there are all these connections going on. We're using football to show that the world is connected, to develop curiosity and an interest in the wider world. But the reason we really wrote it is because there has been a massive crisis in literacy in this country over the last 10 years. And reading for pleasure in that age group is in decline. So it's gone down since 2016 to it's now less than 30% of kids who are under 13 read for pleasure. And there are hundreds of thousands of children that don't have a book of their own. And so what we really want to do with Football School is make sure that every kid has a book. And because 6 and 7 is around the age where kids really start becoming passionate about football, we wanted to give them a subject that they're already into to help them foster and develop a love of reading. Because once you have a love of reading, it never goes. And one of the things that kids have told us is, I don't love reading because there's nothing I want to read about. And so we're getting rid of that excuse by saying, well, if you love football, you will love to read this. And we partnered with a UK charity called World Book Day this year and wrote a special book called 20 Fantastic Football Stories for World Book Day. And the great thing about World Book Day is every school child in the UK gets a free voucher, so they can exchange that voucher for a free book. So every child can get a free book, which is brilliant. And we partnered with the Premier League, who delivered 25,000 copies of our book to schools all around the UK, which was absolutely brilliant. And the power of and importance of World Book Day is really inspiring and rewarding, because they want to provide every child in the UK with a book of their own. Sometimes that book is their very first. So we're really aware also this year that the pandemic has widened the economic and educational gap. So children that didn't have a book before the pandemic are even less likely to have had a book. So we're trying to redress the balance, get kids reading, get kids enjoying, learning as well about the world. And I find that a really rewarding and inspiring part of my job. And I work with football clubs and with literacy charities and do workshops with the football clubs in the Premier League as well. So always speaking to kids. I've been doing virtual lessons and virtual workshops with kids in the last year, but hopefully I'll be able to go back to schools and speak to them soon. But again, it's a similar work to what I do with 12 Yards and Edge, Connor, because it's using football as a tool for education and a tool for self-improvement. And I think football has an amazing ability to bring people together and to work as a force for social good. And so I feel privileged and proud that I'm using that to help children and in a way to help adults as well with their professional lives.
Oh, absolutely tremendous initiative. I'll be sure to link in the show notes below, Ben. But finally, to close, Steve Jobs once said that you can only connect the dots going backwards. What traits and soft skills have you embodied in pursuing your passion? And how has your research in football impacted you over the past 10, 15 years in shaping you as a person?
Well, what a very good question, Connor. I would say that because I'm lucky enough to have had these conversations with really inspiring leaders, my approach to everything I do is in some way helped and changed and tweaked often by them. So I've spoken before about Deschamps and Tuchel and some of the lessons we've taken from that. But one of the other fascinating conversations I had was also with someone at Chelsea. So it'll be of interest to you, the head of sports psychology there, Dr. Tim Harkness, who I spoke to about resilience. And I think this is something that we all really need to be aware of, especially as we come out of the current situation where everyone is on a different page, to go back to, as we said at the beginning. And I think people's mental health really needs to be considered and, will be top of mind in how we recover and tweak our relationships or carry on with our relationships, being mindful of where everyone is at. And as I asked for a definition of talent as I went through the journey of the book, I also asked Tim Harkness what his definition of resilience was. And most people think it's bouncing back from adversity, which in some ways it is, but he actually gave me a really fascinating definition of what he sees resilience as. And he sees it as the ability to accurately assess threats and opportunities and to allocate emotional resources accordingly. And I found that really powerful and interesting when you break it down, this idea that every adversity has a consequence, but it's not just adversity that we're talking about. And so the way he defined it was really to ask yourself three questions, which is which helps us decide whether an emotional response is accurate or not. So the first one is around intent. The next one is around frequency, and the final one is around impact. So the first question, let's give an example of something that I would need to be resilient about. So the example that Tim gave me was, we're standing on the train. So you and I, Connor, are standing on the train together, and you stand on my toe, and it really hurts. So the first question I have to ask is it me, right? Intent. Did you actually intend to stand on my toe and hurt my toe? So I would probably say no to that. Therefore, any emotional response would need to be tempered with that. If it was yes, and you did do it on purpose, then my next question is frequency. So how often do you stand on my toe when we're together? And does it always happen when we're together, or is it only happening now? And if it's always happening and you're always standing on my toe, then again, I would need to have a different emotional response. that is accurate to what has happened. And the final question is about impact. So having broken my toe, is the pain more important than anything else in my life? Does the whole relationship we have revolve around you standing on my toe and nothing else? And that's the wider context. And these three things, I think, are actually really powerful and helpful tools for me, not only during a stressful period like we're currently in, but also in any normal period when you're waiting for a phone call from a colleague, or upset that someone hasn't liked something on social media, or whatever it is. Are these accurate emotional responses to things, right? What is the intent? What is the frequency? What is the actual impact? And I think we do need to be resilient right now. We also need to be thoughtful and considerate. But when we're thinking about our own behaviors and our own way of managing stress, that algorithm has been really helpful to me. So as I said, I've been lucky to speak to these leaders who have helped me in my personal and professional life, using the psychology of sports performance, kind of self-optimize my own individual development, and I hope I can do that for others as well.
Certainly believe you have been. It's a tremendous way to close. I mean, I think the constant theme throughout your life's work, so to speak, is that you do believe football is a tool for education and self-improvement. I'll be sure to attach Edge, the 12-yard Substack, and everything else in the show notes below. But should anybody else wish to initiate a conversation with yourself, Ben, where's best to connect on social media?
So yeah, you can connect on Twitter. I'm at Ben Lytt, BenLyt. I'm also on LinkedIn, Ben Lyttleton. So the usual methods. I've also got a website for football school, which is footballschool.co. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that, it's footballschool.co. But yeah, it's not easy. It's not difficult to find me, sadly.
Fantastic. It'll go on the show notes below. Ben, once more, thank you for taking the time out. Top man.
Thank you, Connor.